First story, the white fence paranoia. After my divorce, I craved simplicity. Somewhere quiet, a place where I could fade into the background and piece myself back together. So when I found a small house on the outskirts of a town in Indiana, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. It had a tidy yard, just big enough to feel spacious, but not so big that it required a lot of upkeep. Perfect. My next-door neighbor was a peculiar elderly woman named Mrs. Grant. She was frail but sharp-eyed, always out tending to her rose bushes or carefully pruning her hedges. Her property was lined with a white picket fence, freshly painted and obsessively maintained, the kind you'd see in postcards of idyllic small-town America. I was new, and she didn't seem particularly interested in chatting, so I left her to her gardening. But then it started. Small things, odd things that grew into a pattern I couldn't ignore. One late afternoon, I stepped outside to adjust the lawn sprinkler, and as I approached the fence, there she was, Mrs. Grant, just standing on her side, staring at me, as if she'd been waiting for me to come close. Her eyes were sharp, piercing in a way that felt invasive, even hostile. When I waved, she didn't respond, just kept staring until I finally walked away. This happened again and then again. It became almost predictable. Every time I so much as brushed against the side of my lawn that neared her property, I'd find her there staring. Not a word, just watching. It got under my skin in ways I didn't want to admit. I'd glance out the window sometimes, and I could swear I saw her silhouette tucked among the hedges, her gaze fixed directly on my house. The worst part? One morning, I found a note on my doorstep. A single line, scratched out with what looked like shaky handwriting. Stay away from the fence. For a while, I tried convincing myself it was just an elderly woman's strange quirk. But the note added a layer of menace I couldn't shake. I decided to avoid the fence, keeping my distance. But Mrs. Grant was relentless. I started noticing little glints hidden among her hedges. Tiny, camouflaged cameras mounted on wooden stakes. I couldn't be sure at first, but one day, I saw the lens clearly, angled towards my windows. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. Who installs surveillance like that? And why on me? After another restless night spent wondering what she thought I'd done, I gathered the courage to confront her. I knocked on her door, fists clenched, trying to hide the tremor in my hands. She opened the door slowly, a soft smile on her lips, but there was nothing welcoming in her eyes. "What do you want?" she asked, as if I were the intruder. Why do you have cameras pointed at my house?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. Her gaze hardened, and then she said something that sent a chill down my spine. "I'm trying to keep you safe, Ethan." Her tone was as serene as if she were discussing the weather. "Safe from what?" I asked, bewildered. She gave me a long, almost pitying look before replying. "It's not safe on this side of the fence. Not for you. I'm the only one here keeping things in order." With that, she closed the door, leaving me on her doorstep, dumbfounded. That night, I lay awake, her words looping in my head. Safe from what? She was the danger here, her obsessive surveillance, the intimidation, the sinister notes. Couldn't live like this. I'd never had peace of mind since moving in. The next morning, fueled by a mix of frustration and defiance, I decided to tear down the fence. She didn't own it. It was on the boundary line, and I figured it might give her the message to back off. I grabbed my tools and set to work, tearing off the boards, each rip a small victory. By dusk, I dismantled a large chunk of it. I felt liberated, but exhausted, and I trudged back into the house, deciding I'd finish the job in the morning. But the morning never came the way I expected. I woke up sprawled in my yard, the grass damp and cold beneath me. My head throbbed, and my arms felt like lead. I struggled to sit up, feeling disoriented and sick. A strange, metallic taste lingered in my mouth, and when I tried to stand, my legs buckled. I could barely make it back inside before collapsing on the floor. When I finally managed to call for help, I was taken to the hospital, where the doctors told me I'd been exposed to some kind of chemical agent. One that caused dizziness, nausea, and confusion. They didn't know how I'd been exposed, but the theory was some kind of toxin had somehow found its way into my bloodstream. They asked if I'd handled anything unusual. All I could think about was the fence. When I got home, the fence was back up, not as it had been but fully reconstructed in that pristine white. And Mrs. Grant? She was gone. Her house was locked up tight, and it stayed that way for days, then weeks. No one saw her. The police didn't take my report seriously, chalking it up to some kind of accident on my part. But before long, new neighbors moved in, and Mrs. Grant became a ghost of a memory in the neighborhood. The strangest part, though, was the letter I found in her mailbox weeks after she vanished. It was addressed to me. Inside was a single sentence scrawled in her trembling handwriting. "Something in you doesn't belong, and I won't be around to protect you anymore." I left Indiana shortly after that, but I'll never forget her words, or the feeling that settled in afterward, that maybe Mrs. Grant's paranoia wasn't entirely her own. Second story, Midnight Silence. I moved to the little town of Glenford, Maine, at the tail end of October, when the leaves were bleeding orange and red, and the evening sky hung low and gray. The house was the sort you'd expect to see on the edge of a New England town. White paint peeling, a creaky porch, surrounded by empty woods that stretched on forever. It was quiet here, unsettlingly quiet. At first, the silence felt refreshing. I'd left behind the constant hum of Boston for this supposed peace, but I couldn't shake the strange, muffling quality of it here, especially at night. No birds, no cicadas, nothing. Just an empty, ringing silence that settled deep, as if it were watching me. The first time I noticed my neighbor, Trevor, he was standing in his window across the street, partially hidden behind the curtain, his eyes fixed on me as I unpacked boxes on the porch. I waved, but he didn't move, not even to wave back. He just stood there, staring, his expression shadowed and unreadable. I brushed it off, telling myself he was just a lonely guy, curious about the new face in town. Over the next few days, though, I'd catch glimpses of him more often, always in that window, always staring, at odd times of the day or night. Even in the middle of the night, when I'd wake up parched and step into the kitchen for water, I'd see him there, his silhouette etched against the window like a dark, silent specter. When I finally met some of the locals at the grocery store, I asked casually if anyone knew much about Trevor. A woman named Margie shook her head slowly. "All I know is that he keeps to himself. Strange hours, that one, always coming and going late at night," she muttered, casting a wary look over her shoulder, as if he might be standing right behind her. There was something off about the way everyone talked about him. Polite but distant, like they were all too happy to avoid him entirely. One night, I was jolted awake by a strange sound. It was faint at first, barely more than a shuffling, like someone moving around in my basement. I held my breath, listening as the sound grew louder. There it was, distinct now, heavy, dragging footsteps, the kind that make the floorboards creak and groan. My first thought was that it had to be an animal. I'd seen raccoons and stray cats around, but these footsteps, they sounded human, and they didn't waver, moving deliberately, pacing in slow circles beneath me. My heart hammered as I tiptoed down the stairs. In the thick darkness, I held my phone's flashlight in one shaky hand and gripped a frying pan in the other. I didn't see anything at first, just the same dusty boxes, the old water heater, and cobwebs crowding the corners. Then I noticed something odd, a faint draft seeping from the wall on the far side. I moved closer and felt the wall, cold as stone, until my fingers found a seam, a door, concealed within the paneling. I pulled it open slowly, and there, stretching out before me, was a narrow, pitch-black tunnel. The air was stale and thick, and every instinct in my body screamed to close that door and bolt. But curiosity overpowered my fear. I took a few shaky steps into the darkness, my flashlight trembling, illuminating the damp stone walls on either side. The tunnel led directly to Trevor's basement. My heart sank as the beam of my flashlight revealed the room. Along the walls, meticulously arranged, were photos of me, hundreds of them. Candid, private moments from every angle. Me unpacking on the porch, sitting by the window, sleeping. Each image was sharp, detailed, taken with disturbing closeness, as if he'd been inches away. Then I saw something that made my skin go cold. A recent picture, so recent I was wearing the pajamas I had on at that very moment. My hand flew to my mouth as I backed away, tripping over a low box, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet. Footsteps sounded upstairs. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline fueling me, and sprinted out of that tunnel. I could feel his presence behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I locked the basement door behind me, my entire body trembling as I dialed the police. They arrived quickly, sweeping through Trevor's home, searching for evidence. But there was nothing. No photos, no passage, nothing. Trevor sat in his living room, calm and unbothered, his face a mask of innocence. He even looked surprised to see the police. "There's no sign of any connecting tunnel," the officer told me, shaking his head. "No evidence he's been anywhere near you." When they left, Trevor caught my eye from his porch. He smiled. It was the only time I ever saw him smile. A slow, curling grin that left me nauseous. That night, I packed everything I could and left Glenford. I drove through the night, as far away as I could, the weight of dread lifting slightly as I left that town behind. Finally, after hours on the road, I pulled into a gas station at dawn. I stepped out, stretched, trying to shake off the exhaustion. And that's when I noticed a crumpled envelope tucked into my glove compartment. My hands shook as I opened it, my breath catching as I read the words scrawled in neat, familiar handwriting. "Did you like my farewell gift? Third story, the secret of the mailboxes. I've lived in Oak Hollow for about 2 years now, in a quiet suburb just outside Cleveland. My wife and I moved here when we were expecting our first child, drawn by the cozy little neighborhood, the well-kept lawns, and the friendly neighbors who seemed to know each other well enough to feel like family. One of the first people I met was Mr. Grayson, a retired cop who lived 2 doors down. He had that seen-it-all look, the kind of eyes that missed nothing, but he was always polite, with a nod and a "Hey, son" whenever we crossed paths. It started about 3 months ago, on an overcast Thursday afternoon. I found a letter in our mailbox, a plain white envelope with no return address, no stamps, just my name typed on the front. I wasn't expecting anything, so I opened it right there. Inside was a single slip of paper with a short, typed message. "Leave the neighborhood before it's too late." It seemed like a prank at first. Maybe some bored kid in the neighborhood pulling a joke, or some kind of misunderstanding. I mentioned it to my wife, but she just laughed it off, saying maybe I was watching too many crime shows. That night, I almost threw the letter away but ended up stashing it in my desk drawer. I wasn't one to let things go easily, and something about it stuck with me. 2 days later, I was on my usual Saturday morning run down Oak Avenue when I noticed something strange on the mailboxes along the street. A faint, chalky red mark on the bottom corner of each one. A small symbol that looked like a number 8 or maybe an infinity sign, scrawled hastily in what looked like red chalk. Curious, I jogged closer and checked a few more boxes on my route. The symbol was on maybe 1 in every 5 mailboxes, including ours. When I got home, I mentioned it to my wife, but she shrugged it off again. Still, the markings nagged at me, so I decided to casually ask Mr. Grayson about it that afternoon. "Oh, those marks," he said, giving me a look that was almost pitying. "Kids around here pull pranks every now and then. Don't think anything of it, Michael. Best to leave it alone." His response was too quick, too rehearsed. As a former cop, he'd have recognized a mark like that as a deliberate sign, a message, and he wouldn't have just brushed it off so casually. The way he looked at me before heading back into his house left me with a strange sense of foreboding. Later that week, I decided to look into the house's history. I headed down to the local records office and requested files on our property. That's when I came across something chilling. The last couple who lived in our house, the Lawrences, had disappeared a few years ago. There was no news about it in any of the local papers, and their family had stopped making inquiries not long after. No missing persons posters, no formal investigation. Just gone. And they weren't the only ones. Every house with a red mark had once been occupied by someone who had vanished without a trace. Families, couples, even an elderly widow, all had simply disappeared, their cases growing cold. That night, I couldn't sleep. I told my wife everything, but she thought I was getting too worked up, convinced it was all a coincidence or perhaps some neighborhood ghost story. But I knew better. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I went over to Mr. Grayson's house, determined to get answers. As I knocked on his door, though, I noticed curtains twitching in nearby windows. Neighbors peered out, then quickly turned away, avoiding my gaze as if afraid. Mr. Grayson opened the door just a crack, eyes dark and guarded. "I told you not to ask questions, Michael. You don't want to know," he said, voice low. "People have vanished from here. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's going on." A sigh escaped him, and for a moment, his hard stare softened. "Sometimes things don't make sense, son. Sometimes people are just chosen. This place has been here long before me, long before any of us, and it's got its own way of keeping balance." "Keeping balance? What does that even mean?" I asked, but he only shook his head, stepping back. "Don't ask about things you don't understand. There's no stopping it." He closed the door before I could get another word out. I stood there, heart pounding, realizing I just made a mistake. Whatever this was, Mr. Grayson and the other neighbors seemed complicit. 2 nights later, my wife woke me up at 2 a.m., saying she heard noises outside. I looked out the window and felt my blood run cold. A small group of people, neighbors I recognized, were gathered near our mailbox, hunched over, drawing something onto the ground. The red symbol. I watched in horror as they finished and walked off silently, their eyes never turning toward our house. The next morning, our mailbox bore a new symbol, this one larger, more elaborate, like a twisted version of the infinity sign but with sharp angles and a strange, almost rune-like quality. I tried confronting our neighbors, tried to find anyone who would explain, but everyone avoided me, refusing even to meet my gaze. My wife was terrified and wanted to leave, but I wasn't about to let these people drive us out. And then, nothing. For weeks, nothing happened. No more letters, no strange chalk marks, no late-night visitors. I started to think maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe it really was some odd neighborhood prank, some twisted local folklore that didn't mean anything real. But the night before last, I heard the noise again. I went outside, thinking I might catch someone messing around with our property, but the street was empty. I looked back toward our front door and froze. There, in red chalk, scrawled across the door itself, were the words, "You were warned." I ran back inside, heart racing, and called the police. They arrived, took a statement, and promised to keep an eye on the place. But by morning, the chalk was gone, scrubbed clean as if it had never been there. That's when I realized the truth. No one would believe me. Not my wife, not the police, no one. Whatever was happening in Oak Hollow had everyone under its spell. Everyone except me. I'm writing this now, not because I think it will save me, but because someone else needs to know. Maybe the next family, whoever moves into this house, will find this and leave before it's too late. As for me, I don't think I'll be here much longer. Fourth story, the drill sound. I moved into a quiet neighborhood just outside of Portland, Oregon, about a year ago. At first, it seemed perfect. A mix of older couples and young families, close to town but far enough for peaceful nights. And it was, except for one small thing. Aaron, my next-door neighbor, would occasionally make strange noises in his garage. At first, it was nothing more than a faint buzzing, a thud here and there. But about 2 months ago, the noise took on a darker tone. Every night, around 3 in the morning, I'd wake to the relentless sound of a drill coming from Aaron's garage. First, I tried to ignore it. People work on all sorts of projects, right? And maybe he had a strange schedule. But night after night, the sound didn't let up. I'd sit up in bed, listening to the shrill whine of the drill, the whirring and grinding sounds that seemed to go on forever. One morning, after a particularly sleepless night, I ran into Aaron as I was taking out the trash. He was tall, maybe in his late 40s, with a gentle voice and a constant, almost unsettling calm. I decided to address it head-on. "Hey, Aaron, I noticed you've been working in your garage pretty late recently. That drill's been pretty loud." He looked at me, and for a second, I thought I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Annoyance, maybe? Then, his usual soft smile returned. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Clara. I didn't realize it was so loud. I'll keep it down." I went back to my place feeling almost guilty, but the drilling didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. The noise grew louder, more frantic, each night like he was pushing the tool into something dense, something that fought back. It didn't take long for me to realize that it wasn't just a drill. There were other sounds too, thumps, clatters, sometimes even a low hum that vibrated through the walls. I started watching him closely. During the day, he'd be outside as friendly as ever, but I noticed he'd leave the garage only late at night, carrying heavy bags to his trash cans. And he always wore dark clothing, sometimes with strange smudges across his sleeves or pants. The stains were dark, like oil or worse, blood. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, that I'd let the lack of sleep get to me. Then, 2 weeks ago, I saw something that made my skin crawl. I was heading home late, and as I turned onto our street, my headlights caught Aaron in his driveway. He had a large black bag slung over his shoulder, but what got me was his expression. He looked vacant, as if he wasn't even aware of what he was doing. His eyes stared ahead, unfocused, as he dropped the bag into his trash can and dragged himself back into the garage, the door shutting quietly behind him. I couldn't take it anymore. That night, at exactly 3 a.m., the drilling started again. My heart raced, adrenaline kicking in. I grabbed a flashlight and decided to confront him once more. I go straight to his garage and knock on the door. I made my way across my yard and crept up his driveway. His garage door was slightly ajar, and in a moment of reckless curiosity, I stepped inside. The smell hit me first, a metallic, almost rotten stench that made me gag. My flashlight swept across the room, landing on shelves filled with tools. Not just tools, though. There were hooks, wires, chains, things that looked like they had no business being in a normal garage. And on the far wall, under a faint, flickering light, I saw photos. Dozens of them, each showing a different face, some smiling, some grim. I recognized a few of them from the local news reports, people who'd gone missing in the last few years. My pulse hammered in my ears as I realized the drill wasn't even the worst sound in this place. I turned to leave, heart pounding in my throat, but a shadow blocked the exit. Aaron stood there, calm as ever, his eyes gleaming in the dark. He gave me a smile, that same soft, gentle smile he always wore, and said, "It's incredible, isn't it, Clara? How nobody hears anything on this street." I felt like my legs had turned to lead. Somehow, I forced myself to move, ducking past him and sprinting back to my house. Once inside, I locked every door, turned off every light, and sat in the darkness, shaking. The police didn't believe me. Without physical evidence, they dismissed it as paranoia or even a bad dream. Aaron carried on as usual, his friendly greetings every morning, as if nothing had happened. But he knew, every so often, I'd catch him watching me from across the yard, and he'd give me that same smile. Now, I get anonymous texts almost every night. Messages that say things like, "You're next," Or you're always being watched. I don't know who they're from. There's no number, no trace. I barely sleep, and each night at 3 a.m., I brace myself, waiting to hear that drill start up again. Fifth story, the House of Whispers. Emily and I thought we were making the right move when we left Boston and bought a quiet place up in Vermont. It was a small, cozy cottage on a long, empty road, surrounded by tall pines and thick fog that hung over the hills like old secrets. Everything about the house felt like it belonged to some forgotten story, like it had seen things and wanted to keep them hidden. It wasn't our first choice, but the price was too good to ignore. Our only neighbors, the Johnsons, were an elderly couple who lived in a worn, two-story farmhouse just down the hill. Mr. Johnson had thick, wiry hair and a broad smile that hid his eyes under creases, while Mrs. Johnson was frail and thin, but sharp, with the kind of gaze that seemed to look right through you. They greeted us warmly, bringing us freshly baked bread on the first evening, and told us to let them know if we ever needed anything. "You'll find these woods have their own way of talkin'," Mr. Johnson said with a smile that, in hindsight, seemed almost apologetic. The first few weeks were peaceful. Emily and I settled in, painting walls, fixing creaky doors, and enjoying the quiet nights. But then, as October set in, something changed. We began hearing voices, soft, indistinct whispers that drifted through our open windows late at night. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but Emily heard them too. They seemed to come from the direction of the Johnsons' house, yet when I checked, the farmhouse lights were always off. One night, unable to sleep, I walked outside, standing still and listening. The whispers were faint, like the sound of someone saying our names through clenched teeth. I told myself it was just the creaking of the old trees, or maybe some animal rustling through the leaves. But then I heard it. A clear, chilling whisper. They should go. The next day, I casually brought it up to Mr. Johnson, hoping he'd tell me it was just the wind or that they had a busted window catching the night air in a strange way. Instead, he just looked at me with that same eerie smile and said, "Oh, those are just friendly warnings. Ain't nothing to worry about, unless you're thinking of staying too long." Emily and I tried to brush it off, but the whispers grew louder each night. Soon, they were unmistakable, calling our names in desperate, pleading voices. Every time we heard them, they seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods, closer to our house. One night, driven by equal parts terror and curiosity, I grabbed a flashlight and headed out to investigate. Emily was too afraid to come with me, so I went alone. I followed the sound through the trees, my heartbeat pulsing in my ears as the whispers led me to a small, neglected graveyard surrounded by twisted, ancient oaks. Moss-covered stones jutted from the ground at odd angles, half hidden by fallen leaves and vines. I knelt down to read the names. The graves belonged to people who had once lived on this road, names I vaguely recognized from the deeds and documents we'd read when purchasing the house. I shined my light over one stone and froze. It was dated back only 30 years and marked the grave of a Samuel F. Johnson. Mr. Johnson had never mentioned losing a son. And below that grave was another, dated just 10 years ago, marked Sarah L. Johnson. A chill ran down my spine as I recalled Mrs. Johnson's piercing gaze, her frail frame almost spectral. I felt like someone was watching me, so I turned to leave, but then the whispers surged around me, louder, circling me, filling my ears until I thought I'd go mad. The next morning, I confronted the Johnsons. They didn't deny it, didn't even flinch when I mentioned the graveyard. Instead, Mrs. Johnson placed her cold hand on mine and said, "This house has its ways, son. It don't take kindly to strangers, but we're here to guide folks, help them leave before it's too late." Then, with a strange calmness, she added, "Most folks don't listen, though." Emily was terrified. That night, we packed what we could and planned to leave at first light. But just past midnight, the whispers returned. They weren't soft this time. They were relentless, circling the house, each voice full of desperation, anger, and a dreadful urgency. Emily clung to me as shadows flickered outside our window. When I looked, I saw figures standing in the yard, pale, indistinct shapes, their faces barely visible in the faint moonlight. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson were there, but there were others, people I didn't recognize, with hollow eyes and expressions that looked both mournful and furious. They crowded closer, surrounding the house, whispering, almost chanting. Emily and I barely slept, clutching each other in the darkness, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. Just before dawn, the voices stopped, and when I dared to look outside, the yard was empty. We didn't waste a second. We grabbed our bags, threw them into the car, and sped away, leaving the house and everything in it behind. Weeks later, still haunted by the memories, I checked the local listings online. The house was back on the market. The description was eerily similar to the one that had drawn us in. Cozy cottage, quiet and secluded, perfect for a young couple. Then, buried in the listing details, was a note that chilled me to the bone. Previous owners last seen October 10th, house is vacant and ready for new occupants. As I scrolled through the photos, my heart skipped a beat. In the background of one picture, just by the edge of the woods, I saw them, the Johnsons, or at least, figures that looked just like them, standing side by side, eyes fixed on the camera, their smiles thin and expectant.